companies own the Canadian media, control and own the data we create, and have a stranglehold on who can access the internet. This report falls short of saying what needs to be said and doesn't suggest the disruptions needed to address inequalities created by the current state of governance. In the same vein as the Liberals' digital charter, this report is a carefully crafted piece of work designed to give cover to upholding the status quo, not to disrupting it. That's about to change. And that's why I'm here today, to outline my priorities as Shadow Minister for Industry and Economic Development in this minority parliament. And I'm joined here today by somebody who also have a big role in this, my colleague Steven Blaney, the Shadow Minister for Heritage. As any government of Canada has operated within the space, I know, I've been in government and I've seen firsthand the pressure exerted by these companies to maintain and enforce the status quo. The Liberal government is facing similar pressures, and the mandate letter of the Minister of Industry received to address these problems attempts to tinker around the edges without making any meaningful structural changes. It is my hope that the Liberal government will collaborate with us, discuss our ideas, and view them as viable alternatives to what the big telcos have lobbied for, and implement them within the course of this Parliament instead of allowing the status quo to continue. Our policy priorities are as follows. Priority 1. Explore implementing a legal framework to enshrine data dignity in Canada. Right now, each of us create thousands of pieces of data. Your smartphone is telling companies where you are, what you ate for breakfast, what you searched in Google, what your friends are doing, and more. This information has created a trillion-dollar global industry and has changed what privacy fundamentally means. This issue will only accelerate in the coming decade. In many ways, data is becoming more valuable than labor in terms of our daily productive output, but yet none of us have inherent, clearly defined rights to the data we produce. These should be viewed as property rights and treated as such. Just as we don't accept the concept that we shouldn't be, or that we should be forced to work for free, in our new economy, we should not accept that we don't have rights to the ownership of the data we produce. Creating a legal framework to enshrine this right, that each of us are the owners of the data we create, that there is an inherent value to it, and that every Canadian has the right to place and derive value from it will allow efficient systems to emerge by which to give Canadians direct control over their data and privacy. The Liberals have done nothing to protect this right. This is a much more democratic idea than setting up pedantic, out-of-date, ineffectual, and bloated government regulatory bodies to enforce data privacy that also don't allow Canadians to derive value from their property. Anyone who went to a European news site in the last week and clicked through "We use cookies, please accept" link will understand this point. Further legislation should also be explored to clearly outline what data the Government of Canada can collect, what they can use this data for, and under what circumstances. The issue of Statistics Canada suggesting that they were going to collect banking transaction data is an example of the need for this type of legislation and to clearly define who watches the watchman. Priority 2, dismantle the regulatory framework that prevents every Canadian from having fast, reliable, affordable access to the internet. In the same way that highways and roads connect Canada, enable our economy, and our public goods, so now is the internet. I want this government to acknowledge that access to fast, ready, affordable internet is a catalyst for inequality. The Liberals are not taking this seriously. The stranglehold that the telcos have is cultivating negative social outcomes for our country. It grows the divide between urban and rural Canada and between poor and rich Canada. It is a reconciliation issue, and it is a potential recessionary catalyst. Every time the government does something to lessen the stranglehold of this oligopoly, like the recent ruling on small internet providers, it has been suggested by other stakeholders that the oligopoly employs end runs, opposes rulings, or blindly ignores them knowing that they won't be enforced, employs tactics like predatory pricing, and more. The Liberals have done nothing while the telcos have gone as far as to suggest what could be viewed as blackmail, suggesting that access for rural communities will only come when they get their way, and enough is enough. This cannot be a third rail in Canadian politics. When an industry is 100% dependent on government regulation to prop it up, it is dead or dying. Conservatives call on Trudeau's cabinet to, at least in the short term, as a short-term measure, uphold the CRTC's landmark ruling on competition. Our party will look for ways to disrupt the regulatory environment so that the hardest-to-reach Canadian will have access in a 3-year period. If we can build a railway across Canada through the Canadian Shield and Rocky Mountains, surely 100 years later, we can figure out how to get fibre laid and cellular data infrastructure built without acquiescing to the discriminatory demands of a bloated oligopoly. We will also encourage the government to move away from the existing system of spectrum auctioning. The current government creates monopolies by auctioning off long-term leases. Real competition requires making sure these rights are always contestable and can quickly be transferred to innovative entrepreneurs when they need them. We will push for the government to examine more democratic and efficient ways such as spectrum leasing or self-assessed licenses sold at auction, or SALSA for short. We will also push for consumer rights to stop predatory practices such as setup fees, disconnect fees, charges for changing your package or service, forcing users to be subjected to high-pressure sales tactics rather than simply being allowed to change their package online, data portability, and the right to repair. In a free market system, we wouldn't see such absurdity. Priority 3. A new legal and law enforcement framework to address the security issues related to the 5G operating environment. When security training started, governments needed to respond with legal and regulatory frameworks to govern this new way of doing business. We need to view the coming 5G operating environment in a similar light. We urgently need a legal and enforcement framework that reflects the digital revolution. We know that 5G will create multiple entry points for bad actors to access data and even disrupt networks. Regardless of who supplies the hardware and software, 5G networks need to be secured from malicious sources entering. As an example, in coming years, Canadians will need to look at home security not solely from the perspective of someone breaking into their home with a crowbar, but by hacking their 5G-enabled crockpot. Canadians need to be assured that their data, our economy, and way of life will be secured as interoperability of devices become ubiquitous over the next 10 years. Further, we need a framework to ensure compatibility with allied countries and trading partners doesn't sacrifice Canadian security. Liberals have done nothing to address this dramatically changing landscape. I will be putting forward motions to study and develop such a framework at our industry committee, and will be ensuring that this government is transparent with the rubric they are using in making the ruling on the use of Huawei technology in the Canadian 5G operating environment. Priority 4. Democratizing the choice and access to Canadian content funding. The government has a role to play in enabling the creation of Canadian content, but the current Liberal Party Party-supported way of gathering and dispersing funds is condescending and paternalistic, and marginalizes communities not understood by bureaucrats outside of Ottawa. It creates barriers for and prevents intersectional voices and new entrants from nimbly creating and distributing their work. This creates inequality, stifles voices and talents, and renders the Canadian film industry at a competitive disadvantage as compared to other countries. It also prevents Canadians from having a direct say and choice over what content is being created, leaving that decision to big telcos, lobbyists, and bureaucrats. This system needs to evolve. We have technology to give every Canadian a say in how these funds are spent, so why don't we? We know that there are alternatives to governments telling Canadians what they should watch. Instead of relying on well-intentioned but arguably out-of-date systems like the Canadian Media Fund, government-controlled print media funds, and Crown Corporation models, we can explore fixing this by using crowdfunding-type platforms based on cutting-edge technologies like quadratic financing created by Canadian innovators like GitHub and Gitcoin. Experts, in fact, have already, since this report has been released, suggested that the Liberals' new taxation and regulatory regime on streaming services is questionable in light of the new U.S. trade agreement and, frankly, in light of the Canadian Charter. And our last priority, empowering Canadians to think critically about content on social media as opposed to regulating free speech. The Liberals are floating new regulatory structures to define what can be said on social media. They would never do this for the dying print media, mainstream media industry, so why is it acceptable in this space? It isn't. Further, this proposed regime could be a threat to net neutrality. We believe in the inherent intelligence of every Canadian's ability to think for themselves, and will push for improved ways to enable Canadians to critically evaluate the content they're seeing, rather than stifle free speech on the new ways in which our society communicates. In closing, the government needs to use new technology and political economic theory to unleash innovators and Canadians from costly bureaucratic structures that inhibit growth, competition, and technological transformation. We need to seek to radically democratize and give certainty to participants in the digital economy, not to give it a slow death by government. We can give Canadians a new deal, one that empowers our country for success and instead of letting it pass us by. And that's our job, so let's actually do it. My colleague will make a few remarks.
Alors, merci beaucoup, Mme Rempel, et je remercie Michel d'avoir couvert le volet, je dirais, industrie du présent rapport. J'aimerais maintenant couvrir les aspects qui couvrent davantage le patrimoine. Et à cet égard, je peux vous dire que nous accueillons favorablement le rapport qui a été présenté par Mme Yale et Mme Simard ici en cette enceinte il y a à peine quelques minutes. Et je vous dirais d'entrée de jeu, ce qui m'a plu davantage dans ce rapport-là, c'est vraiment l'urgence d'agir. Les libéraux n'ont plus dorénavant aucune excuse pour ne pas mettre en place des mesures législatives pour tenir compte de la nouvelle réalité numérique dans laquelle nous évoluons. À titre d'exemple, et ma collègue faisait référence au Fonds canadien des médias, je vous rappelle que le Fonds canadien des médias a été créé par notre collègue James Moore il y a plus de 10 ans de ça. Et c'est le seul outil dont on dispose présentement pour s'assurer et promouvoir le contenu canadien. Au moment où le Fonds canadien des médias a été créé, Spotify avait 250 000 abonnés payants et n'était pas présent au Canada. Aujourd'hui, on parle de plus de 100 millions d'abonnés et on voit l'empreinte des médias numériques dans la société. Alors, effectivement, l'appel aujourd'hui du comité, c'est de mettre en place des outils et évidemment, il y a plusieurs pistes de solutions intéressantes qui sont proposées. Une qui me touche particulièrement, puisque je suis un député rural et je sors d'une campagne électorale, c'est l'accès à Internet. Et on ne peut pas accepter aujourd'hui d'avoir des citoyens de deuxième classe en région qui n'ont pas accès à des services Internet où ils peuvent faire, excusez l'anglicisme, du streaming en temps réel. Et ça, c'est une des recommandations, à mon avis, qui est extrêmement importante, c'est d'accélérer l'accès, notamment en région. Et on le sait, le gouvernement a promis beaucoup d'argent, mais n'a pas été de l'avant. Et on le sait, même le CRTC a des programmes qui mettent de l'avant. Par exemple, dans notre cas au Québec, ils ont dû aller plus rapidement parce que ça prenait trop de temps. Alors, on doit mettre fin à cette léthargie-là de consultation. Aujourd'hui, on arrive au terme d'une vaste consultation et je dois vous dire que ce que la Commission a entendu, c'est ce qu'on a entendu au Comité du patrimoine, c'est ce que l'on entend lorsqu'on rencontre les intervenants. Je tiens également, bien sûr, à souligner l'aspect de l'équité fiscale qui, dorénavant, fait consensus. Il est important que l'ensemble des joueurs, en fin de compte, soient traités sur un même pied d'équité fiscale. Et là-dessus, bien sûr, on n'a qu'à penser, par exemple, justement, aux entreprises canadiennes qui sont désavantagées par rapport aux sociétés étrangères. Enfin, l'élément le plus important, et c'est celui sur lequel j'interpelle, bien sûr, celui que j'oserais qualifier mon vis-à-vis au sein du gouvernement libéral, c'est le ministre Guilbeault. Monsieur le ministre, déposer rapidement des mesures législatives pour faire en sorte que l'ensemble des intervenants puissent soutenir la production de contenu canadien et participer à cette industrie remarquable qui est l'industrie culturelle canadienne. Et en terminant, je dirais, avant peut-être d'ouvrir pour les questions, je dirais ce qui est essentiel là-dedans, c'est qu'il s'agit non seulement d'un enjeu économique, mais il s'agit également de la souveraineté culturelle canadienne. Et les libéraux n'ont plus d'excuses pour ne pas agir. Nous sommes prêts, le comité est prêt à étudier les propositions qui seront mises de l'avant par le gouvernement pour faire face à cette nouvelle réalité et ce nouvel environnement-là numérique dans lequel nous évoluons. Merci.
All right, so we're going to go to questions now. So one question, one follow. Just raise your hand if you want to get on the list. If you don't think you're already, you can raise your hand as enthusiastic as our first questioner, David Aiken from Global, and then followed by Melanie Malky from La Presse.
Good afternoon, folks. Rest. Here we are. Either Michelle or Steven, thank you so much. I guess one of the questions that companies like mine and CTV and have had is why should Netflix, Spotify, and Apple Plus be exempt from the same liabilities and taxation that Canadian companies should? On the reverse, then why shouldn't we also be exempt from those obligations and able to be offer our services tax-free just as our international rivals?
I would argue that it's a false dichotomy. The reality is the major telecommunication companies are the people who are working and have sort of a bigger advantage in the current system of the Canadian Media Fund and how we're dispersing funds right now. So I think to say that there isn't government intervention in that is laying out a narrative that isn't entirely correct. What we're talking about here, first of all, my colleague Stephen is absolutely right. This is a call to action in a space that we should have been acting on some time ago. And the reality is day after day, this is a space that changes so dramatically that we're really behind at this point in time. I think that I think we should be touching the third rail in Canadian politics, which is the sacredness of the systems by which we distribute funds in this space. We have to question their efficacy if they're actually making us competitive, and look for new, more effective ways of doing that. There are new systems for us to do that. What we're saying here today is that we welcome a conversation and that we don't believe that the status quo is working. It's not working. Come on, we all know that. All of you sitting here know that. So how can, rather than entrenching more bureaucracy and taking Canadians away from direct control and democratization of being able to have nimbleness in this space, let's look at ways that we can do that more effectively. We're not saying that government doesn't have a role. We're just saying that the current systems don't work. So rather than layering bureaucracy and layering more government on a process that is arguably very out of date, it might have been it might have worked 10 years ago. It doesn't work today. We can't just look at this decision just in the terms of Canadian content creation. That's why we've laid out all of these other broader macro issues. The telecommunication industry writ large, how we structure it does not work. This is something that I know everyone in this room has an interest in, so do we. But it's something we have to start talking about. And this report, we can't allow this report, the digital charter, the lobbyist community around the telecommunications company to keep essentially dictating the mandate or the narrative on this. As parliamentarians, we want to look at ways to do things new and hopefully things in a new way, and hopefully in a minority parliament situation, we'll be able to collaborate across the aisle
that's the goal.
In doing this.
Absolutely. That's the goal. The goal is to move forward within this legislature. And to complete the answer of my colleague, basically what we're saying is if you're a content provider, you should be treated in the same level playing field. And of course, the current regulation system is not tackling with this issue. And that's why we need to, we are ready to welcome we are welcoming new adapt to the new reality, and also, and I haven't been through the detail of the report, but flexibility is key in this regard.
So just to put a more fine point on it, I know this is not a Netflix tax discussion, but on the HST, why Netflix, Spotify, Apple should not be paying HST for their Canadian revenue, just as Canadian companies have to have an obligation to pay HST, or any business has to pay
First,
HST.
David, it's not a Netflix nor anyone. It's the taxpayer who contribute. So what we're saying here is there's a principle of a conservative principle of equity that has to be taken into account, and that's why we welcome the recommendations that are made by the committee.
And just to build on what Stephen is saying is, like, we're arguing about the wrong thing here. Like we're fixated on a tax, and we're not talking about the fact that we have a regulatory structure that's propping up a system that is completely out of date. So we're arguing down on the finer minutia of taxation when our industry is not competitive. So I guess what we're trying to say here today is we're taking a new tact, this Parliament. We're not getting pulled into the conversations that the lobbyists around this want us to have. We're saying that the system needs broader disruption, and that's what we intend to do.
Okay. So Melanie Marquet, La Presse, and then afterwards we're going to go to Chris Rance from CBC.
Bonjour. Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. Monsieur Blaney, j'aimerais vous entendre sur les propositions entourant Radio-Canada qui sont contenues dans
Les
le rapport.
propositions faites par le comité concernant Radio-Canada sont constructives, à savoir qu'on peut recentrer le rôle de Radio-Canada tout en reconnaissant son rôle de diffuseur public très important. Ceci étant, l'aspect de faire en sorte de permettre à Radio-Canada de se libérer des contraintes reliées aux aspects commerciaux pour aller chercher des revenus publicitaires nous apparaissent intéressants et méritent d'être considérés.
Qu'est-ce qu'un gouvernement conservateur ferait de Radio-Canada?
Puis je vais juste terminer là-dessus. Puis peut-être une autre recommandation qui est faite, c'est d'assurer un financement stable à Radio-Canada. Ça me semble tout à fait logique. De toute façon, vous l'avez vu à travers toutes les années où nous avons été de l'avant. Nous avons maintenu un financement stable de Radio-Canada. contrairement, parce que si on parle d'ampleur, d'envergure de coupures, les plus grandes coupures qui ont été effectuées par Radio-Canada ont été effectuées par des libéraux. Qu'est-ce qui a été fait? C'était simplement qui participe à l'exercice qui visait à rétablir l'équilibre budgétaire, comme dans l'ensemble des ministères. Donc, on a toujours été là. Je vous rappelle même que lors de la crise économique, notre gouvernement conservateur avait maintenu les niveaux de financement à Radio-Canada. Donc, on reconnaît le rôle d'un diffuseur national et l'importance d'avoir un financement stable.
Mais juste en fait pour...
If I can jump in on that, there's a reason why when we were talking about democratizing the choice and access to Canadian funding, we specifically talked about the Canadian Media Fund, government-controlled print media funds, and Crown corporations. I think we have to have a broader conversation in Canada about what Canadians want in terms of the money that we're spending on Canadian content creation. And while it's very important that government has a role in that and that system is well financed, that no area of that should be exempted given the changes that we've seen within the industry in the last 5 to 10 years. So I think what we're both saying is that rather than what the Conservative Party is going to do in this platform is rather than just arguing, as David said, the finer points of the status quo, is that we're going to try and look at things in a different light. And hopefully what we're managing to is that Canadians have more access, more variety of access to Canadian content, and that Canadian content creators that their voices aren't stifled. And this is going to be a difficult conversation because everybody here has interests in that system. But maybe it's about time we started to look at ways to make it better.
Juste préciser ma question, Jordan. Monsieur Blaney, je voulais savoir, en fait, ce qu'un gouvernement conservateur ferait du niveau de financement. Vous savez que les libéraux ont réinvesti. Est-ce qu'un gouvernement conservateur maintiendrait...
Écoutez, j'aurais aimé vous donner la réponse, mais le 21 octobre, la population canadienne en a décidé autrement, alors qui vivra verra. Je ne peux pas m'engager là-dessus à ce moment-là. Vous savez, présentement, le gouvernement canadien, la façon dont les libéraux gèrent les finances publiques est plutôt préoccupante, mais à ce moment-ci, on a toujours assuré, ce que je peux vous dire, c'est qu'on a toujours assuré un financement stable de Radio-Canada en dépit notamment de la crise économique. Voilà.
Okay, so Chris Rand, CBC, and afterwards, going to go to Catherine Levesque from Press Canadian.
Hi, my first question is for Ms. Rempel Garner. Ms. Rempel Garner, are you entering the Conservative leadership race at this point?
That's not what I'm here to talk about today.
Are you entering the leadership race?
That is
I'm
not
just
what I'm
asking.
here to talk about today. Thank you.
So my second question is to
Are
both
you
of
asking me this question too?
Your sense of humor precludes
I've
you,
been there,
Get
done
in,
there.
Stephen.
If I may, for my second question, which is to both of you, would you answer one at a time, please? Is this the Conservative leadership race that you had expected at this point?
Again, this is not what we're here to talk about today.
I can scrum you afterwards. I mean,
Sure.
I'm just...
Sure.
So, Mr. Blaney?
I think we should focus on the issue. This is an important, there's a call for action on the heritage file, and I would like to focus on this morning, if you don't mind. And if you want to know my own personal ambition, I've been there, done that.
Okay, so Catherine Levesque from Press Canadian, and then
Oui.
afterwards, going to go to Rod from The Logic.
Absolument. Bonjour. Je veux juste clarifier votre position, M. Blaney, sur l'équité fiscale, parce que vous avez passé votre gouvernement, le gouvernement Harper, a dénoncé la taxe Netflix. Maintenant, vous dites que vous êtes favorable au fait de percevoir la TPS, pardon, pour les entreprises comme Netflix, etc. Donc, je voulais juste m'assurer, est-ce que votre position a changé chez les conservateurs ou votre position reste la même?
Nous avons toujours maintenu la même position d'équité fiscale. Maintenant, j'écoutais tout à l'heure Mme Simard. Évidemment, il faut voir qu'il y a des taxes qui sont dédiées, comme par exemple la taxe sur le Fonds canadien des médias est une taxe qui est une redevance qui est prise par les câblos-distributeurs et qui va à un fonds dédié. Ce à quoi on assiste présentement, c'est que la taxe les revenus des câblos-distributeurs diminuent, alors que les besoins en contenu canadien ne sont pas reliés au nombre d'abonnés qu'on a en câblo-distribution. Alors, l'enjeu d'une taxe dédiée, on s'est toujours opposé, on s'y oppose. Maintenant, le principe d'équité fiscale, M. Andrew, notre chef, a été très clair. On estime qu'on doit bien sûr se baser sur le marché, mais qu'on doit s'assurer comme régulateur qu'on applique les principes d'équité fiscale. Voilà.
Je veux juste m'assurer, encore une fois, que vous disiez la même chose en anglais et en français. Donc, j'en comprends que les conservateurs, de façon générale, vous deux, vous êtes favorables à ce rapport et vous espérez que ce qui est là-dedans soit mis en œuvre ou vous pensez que c'est une perte de temps?
OK. Ben, I will just answer du côté du patrimoine, l'appel à l'action urgente lancé par le comité est extrêmement important et compte tenu, comme je l'ai décrit, alors absolument. Du côté du patrimoine, bien sûr, il y a peut-être d'autres éléments là, concernant notamment, là, je dirais, là, mais qui touchent plus industrie. Là-dessus, je vais laisser ma collègue, Mme Rempel, répondre.
What we're saying today is that, the report, I think it's well-intentioned, but it doesn't address the bigger issues in the Canadian telecommunication industry. So, I think what my colleague we're agreeing is, look, it's good that there's a call to action, that there's a call to change, but I think what's being proposed and what the Liberals have in Minister Baines's mandate letter, the options that they're floating in this broader space, it's not going to change it, right? It's fundamentally, it's layering bureaucracy upon an already bureaucratic system in a highly regulated space that an oligopoly has control over virtually everything. And I think that Canadians have a choice to make. Is this acceptable? So, while we welcome the report from the perspective of it being a call and an impetus to change, we are questioning the best way to have that change occur, and that we aren't supportive of just continuing with the overall regulatory framework in the 5 priority areas that we outlined.
So I'm going to go to Marat from the Logic, and then going to go to Le Journal de Québec.
Hello. So on the first of your four, sorry, I'm losing count, areas, you talked about a framework for data dignity and essentially establishing, as I understand what you're saying, sort of a personal right to an individual's data. Can you explain how that is distinct in any way from what the Liberal government is already proposing in terms of specific data usage rights? Like, what kind of enforcement does a generalized right deliver that they don't?
Well, it allows an individual to place value on that within their own scope of influence as opposed to a government regulatory system. So if you compare what we're suggesting that we should explore to, let's say, the framework that the European Union is in right now with the GDPR, we know that when government is taking the approach of regulating and then enforcing those regulations, that it's not nimble enough, that it's questionable on whether or not this can be used, and frankly, whether or not industry can participate in a meaningful way that allows certainty, because regs always change, enforcement capacity changes. We're saying that that's inefficient, and it actually takes away an individual's right to value their data. So what we're saying is that if we enshrine data dignity as a principle and in legislation in Canada, if we explore that option, then we can actually allow systems by which you're placing value on that data, be it, something like a data cooperative that's deriving value and placing value on that, or a stock exchange for data value. The point that we're trying to say is that there are different ways of doing this that also acknowledge the fact that we're not homogenous in terms of how we value our data. Like, how I value my privacy and my data is different than how my 17-year-old stepdaughter does, right? Like, fundamentally. So it's difficult. What we're saying is that I think best practice shows that it is internationally very difficult and expensive and pedantic and unenforceable for government to be the sole arbiter in the space, and that we're suggesting a conservative free market approach to this. Why are you guys paying the big telcos for the privilege of using your data? It should be the other way around.
And so much of this that you've announced today is new from the campaign, certainly, from the previous Conservative government's policy. You are in the middle of a leadership race. How representative should we take this as Conservative policy on these issues?
Well, I think that Parliament and parliamentarians, somewhere along the way, we lost sort of the ability to speak for new policy and present new approaches in committee. We have consulted broadly with our caucus on this. This is something our leadership candidates can certainly comment on, but it is the approach we'll be taking certainly in this session of Parliament in terms of holding the government to account. And we both have platforms by which to do that, and we will be utilizing them.
Juste pour clarifier, parce qu'il y a encore un doute, là. Le rapport dit que les Netflix, entre autres, et tout ça, là, doivent facturer la TPS à leurs abonnés. Et vous êtes d'accord avec ça?
Ce que je dis, c'est qu'il y a un principe d'équité fiscale. C'est un principe qui a été mis de l'avant par notre chef au cours de la campagne électorale et que c'est un principe conservateur. Alors, ce qu'on dit, c'est qu'on doit s'assurer que les entreprises canadiennes sont traitées sur un pied d'égalité avec les entreprises étrangères en matière de fiscalité.
OK.
So Eli Glasner, CBC, and don't know how much more time you guys have. But.
Can I add something quickly to that? But I think also we have to talk about the fact that what's being presented right now is that somehow Canadian telecom industry does not benefit from government, right? And I just think that that's a bit overstated. And while I think where we all agree is that government right now is looking at to tax the space rather than to make it more functional, and we oppose that principle. Like, space needs to be disrupted.
You talk about being encouraged that you're seeing a more level playing field on behalf of broadcasters and media providers. You also mentioned new ideas such as crowdsourcing. Would you support the idea of forcing the media streamers such as your Netflix to contribute to Canadian content?
Well, I think they already are, right? I mean, what does that look like? What is contributing to Canadian content mean? And how do we do that evenly and in a more democratic way across the playing field? I think that those are committees or questions that our committee can be looking at in Parliament right now. And I just think that the way that the narrative has been laid out, that somehow there's an uneven playing field, we have to be looking at all the subsidies, all of the regulation that gives certain players benefits over another, and not just buying into the narrative that lobbyists have put forward. I mean, it's so funny to listen and look at these slide decks that come forward, and it's just, well, like, to propose that the Canadian telecom industry is somehow not equitably favored compared to other new disruptive services is a bit rich. And what we're saying is we need a new playing field by which we can make the system more equitable.
But part of their rules of that new playing field is forcing providers such as Prime and Netflix to now put dedicated funds, we don't know what percentage yet, to CanCon. So if a bill comes up, would you support that measure?
Sorry, go ahead.
We'll see it when we'll see the bill. What we're saying is 10 years ago, we were faced with a evolving environment, and that's when we created the Canada Media Fund to ensure that the Canadian content was adequately funded. Now, as you know, as we all know, the environment has totally changed. And the Canadian Media Fund is not responding anymore. And as you see, the funds are diminishing because it's a dedicated fund. So what we're saying now is this is a call for action. Now the government has no excuse not to come up with proposals that will face this new reality and the new players as well that were not existing a little while ago. So that's why we will see it, we will judge it when we'll see it. But obviously, time le temps compte parce que ce qui est en jeu, c'est la souveraineté culturelle canadienne.
So, we have time for two more questions. That's okay, or one more?
Well, we love to go to QP, you know.
Maybe one more.
One more, okay. So we're going to go to the back. Tom Korski from Blacklock.
Two short snappers. I'll make them very short. Ms. Rempel or Mr. Blaney, are you satisfied these recommendations would require news media to register federally, that it would put them under the Broadcasting Act, that they would be subject to codes of conduct mandated by the CRTC, that is regulation, and if so, comment?
I just think that this is kind of like the okay boomer response to an industry that, like, we're adding layers of bureaucracy on a system that, like, we're going to be having the same conversation in 3 years if we keep proposing the same sort of nuanced regulatory approach. And I know that that's perhaps not the answer that everybody wants to hear. I'm just saying that, like, there are significant structural challenges in how we're regulating the space that need to be addressed. So what we tried to do today was put forward some alternative ways of looking at things. We're saying we are going to be pressing those alternative ways of looking at things in committee, such that there isn't a vacuum of discourse on these topics.
CBC revenues on television fell 37% last year. They had a campaign to sell radio advertising that collapsed 3 years ago with what the Commission described as minuscule revenues. The proposal is to have Parliament compensate them for sales of advertising that they weren't good at anyway because their audience is shrinking. If this is adopted, do you foresee that the Crown Corporation will be rewarded for failure, it'll be very expensive, and that the network has failed in the marketplace with compensation now due by Parliament?
I would just like to add that there's an ongoing discussion between the society and the government. What we're saying and what we find interesting in the report is redefine, review the mandate of CBC. And based on this mandate, then you can ensure that there's appropriate funding, which is adjustable to the mandate that is defined and in this ongoing discussion.
I'll be more succinct. Parliamentarians and Canadian taxpayers shouldn't be rewarding with continued funds a business model that clearly doesn't work. I'm not saying that there isn't a role. I'm just saying that what we're trying to propose is constructive ways to develop Canadian content that's nimble, that's reflective of every region of the country, every voice in our country, and also say that what's happening right now isn't working. And if we're not being honest about that, then we failed as Parliament.
Okay. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.